what we're trying to talk about is restoring a better equilibrium, responses to geoeconomic fragmentation. That has been the underlying concern of the conference as something that Ravi has worked towards for a long time. So from your perspective, what's the current state of play? What, from Singapore's vantage point, do you see happening with global trade and finance flows?
Yeah, thanks, Adam, and thanks for that very warm introduction. And Adam and I go back quite a while, and we swap stories and learn from one another. I learn a lot from him. I hope he's picked up a few things, but I've never been to Washington, D.C. without trying to see Adam Posen. And I'm particularly pleased with this new partnership between the Peterson Institute and the Lee Kuan Yew School. And I do hope we can continue to build on this. The issues that we are confronted with, like Adam so well summarized, a challenge to globalization is a challenge to the core beliefs, the core ethos of both our countries, or at least a big part of the US, I think, and definitely for Singapore. And I think that the two institutions, the Lee Kuan Yew School and the Peterson Institute, are both ardent advocates of this. And the MAS as a cheerleader for this, for these two parties, shares those same things. I think maybe what I'll do is I'll just try to, from where we see these things, try to make sense of what's happening. I know there are many different terms that is being used to describe what is going on: decoupling, fragmentation, or reconfiguration. And I think there's an element of all those three things going on at the same time. And we probably should avoid making binary conclusions that this is the end of globalization. Or, well, nothing has pretty much changed, some rhetoric, but, I think it's a lot more nuanced and complex than that we have some elements of decoupling in some places, quite severe. In other places, there's some fragmentation, and other places, there's some reconfiguration. And I think we also need to unpack this a little and look at it from, and I would offer 4 dimensions: trade, investment, technology, and finance. And quite different things are happening on all those fronts. The trade issues have attracted the most attention. Now, at the aggregate level, the rate of growth in trade has, of course, slowed over the years. And we look very carefully at US-China trade. Actually, in absolute terms, 2022 was still higher than in 2018. So I think that's sometimes missed, that at the aggregate level, there's not much evidence of a decoupling of trade between the two. What's happened is that, well, the US obviously has stopped buying a lot of semiconductors and chips and other electrical items from China. They're still buying toys, games, a whole range of consumer goods, which are not subject to tariffs and which are not the focus of the US government. So that is happening. The serious decoupling, I think then the other thing that's happening is the composition of global trade is changing. This is where I think both countries and businesses need to pay close attention to. It's not as if everything is coming down. It is being redistributed in ways that we are now only beginning to get a handle on. So if you look at China now trades more with Russia than with Germany. And Germany is the largest trading partner of China in Europe. So that's quite a shift. And soon China will trade more with Brazil than it does with Germany. So these are shifts, and it's showing up as shifts in increased trade volumes between countries who were not trading as much before. And the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS, did a study looking at firm-level data. And they found that basically what's happened is that many of the supply chains have just lengthened, especially the supply chain from production to final consumer in the US, between China and the US, is now going through other channels. So Chinese factories are moving to Vietnam, they're moving to Mexico, they're even moving to India. for final assembly for export into the US. Now, of course, the US, this is not a static thing. The US will, of course, also respond. But it just shows the dynamism of supply chains and reconfigurations and compositional shifts in trade that's going on that we should pay close attention to beyond the headline numbers. The third thing is that there is a very serious decoupling in electronics trade. So overall trade remains not fantastic, but has not fallen off the cliff. But in electronics trade, it has just decoupled between the two. And that's not surprising given the US focus on semiconductors. So China's share in US imports of electronic goods from the rest of the world used to be 50%. Now it's below 40% and falling fast. And China's own imports of electrical goods have been broadly stable. And most of it still comes from Taiwan, Korea, and the Southeast Asian region. And so I think there are compositional shifts that are aggregate and compositional shifts going on in electronics. Now, you look at the next dimension is investment. Here, I think it's more serious, the separation, because both China and the US are inshoring a lot more. And there is some serious decoupling in investment flows. The Japanese and German automakers used to account for about 50% of China's auto market 3 years ago. Now it's 30%, because a lot of domestic production of Chinese automobiles now, this ramping up in automobiles, and I come to electric vehicles, that is quite phenomenal what's happening in China. China is actually supplying for itself. China's outward bound investments have shifted away from the US. It's going into resource-rich countries like Indonesia and into the Middle East. So these are, again, big shifts in investment flows. And you also see Western money coming back to the United States and to places like Mexico. So I think the decoupling is a little bit more serious when it comes to investment flows. You look at electronics investments, also very striking. Greenfield investments in electronics are 3 times more today than they were in 2013 or 2012. And there's a lot of competition going on in this space with domestic investments in greenfield electronics. TSMC is spending $28 billion to build up production capabilities for its chips in the United States. Partly, I think, in response to the CHIP Act, partly in response to what they see as the decoupling in electronics globally. So I think this is quite a serious decoupling that's going on in the investment space, which is much more serious than what you see in the trade space. In fact, I think much of the response to the tariffs on the trade side have been reconfiguring supply chains, but essentially same source of production and final consumption is unchanged, but they're just going through a more tortuous route. But I think in investment space, it is actually getting divorced. I'll quickly touch on technology, and maybe we can come back to that later on. But just for completeness, I think the 2 areas, chips, and the other is clean technologies and renewables. I think on chips, the conventional view, and I think that's a consensus view, the US and its friends have a tremendous lead over China, and they are choking off China's access to advanced chips in several ways. One, of course, the restriction of sales of advanced chips to China. Second, the lithographic equipment used to manufacture the chips are also being blocked. Third, the Taiwanese and Korean firms, which are foundries that supply the designs, are also being blocked. And the software for chip design is also being blocked. So it is systematic across the entire chip value chain, where they've applied choke points on China. China is working very hard to build up its own indigenous capabilities. There is a very healthy diversity of views as to whether China will eventually be able to do it. Some people think not, because the starting advantages that the US enjoys, not just the US, but also key players in that value chain in Europe, in UK, and in Taiwan, will actually make it very difficult for China to close that gap. But on renewables, I think the story is the other way around. China controls the supply chains for many renewable technologies. EVs is a great example. Battery technology is more advanced in China than in the United States. So there, the contestation is taking a different form. I don't know enough about biotechnology, but I think that's another arena where there's going to be contestation in technology. So technology bifurcation, I think, is going to be, in many ways, even more painful, because it is going to stand in the way of the traditional ways in which technology diffusion takes place, learning by doing, and the spreading of knowledge and improvements. That's going to be short-circuited with all these artificial barriers that we're seeing in these areas. And last, of course, finance. Here, I think, thankfully, there's not been much disintermediation. It can take several forms. Sanctions against banks will be very severe, and I think both parties understand that that could lead to very severe consequences of global financial stability. The other dimension, of course, is portfolio investments. Here, I think there has been some change. US capital markets now being more closed to Chinese investments and Chinese listings. So that's giving rise to a shift. Currency, thankfully, we've not seen a war on that front. That would be devastating. Here, of course, the US has dominance through the US dollar. But again, how that will play out if there is going to be the weaponization of the dollar in this conflict. So thankfully, I think both sides, and especially on the US side, I think they understand the very dire consequences to engage in a financial dimension of conflict, because that part is so intertwined that the spillbacks and spillovers are going to be quite devastating. So I think this is a very complex subject, which, again, many people in the audience would have good knowledge of, and I would encourage a lot more in-depth study. This is a dynamic area. What we thought we knew last year, this year looks a bit different. But I thought it was good to look at trade, investment, technology, and finance in quite distinct buckets. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi. And that dovetails nicely with some of the discussions we've had earlier in the conference. Just pick up for a moment on the finance point, which you mentioned. In Washington right now, there's a great deal of attention and, in fact, I would say confidence on the idea that the U.S. government and allies have successfully weaponized SWIFT payments financial system against Russia. You're at the same time saying, for good reason, were those kinds of weaponizations used against the major Chinese banks, for example, the repercussions could be quite great. Do you think the American advocates are deluding themselves, or do you think there is sort of a tacit agreement that it's okay to go after Russia because it's not systemic? Or why do you see this, I shouldn't say why, but where do you see this gap between what you just said and those of us in Washington who see a lot of posturing about the power of the financial system?
Well, I think being in Washington, you would probably know a lot more about this as to how the thinking in the US is on this. From my, by no means broad representation of interactions, I hear voices of caution. Maybe I'm talking to the different group of people, that this is a very potent weapon that the United States has, and precisely because of that, they would be very careful in how they use it, because it's a little like the nuclear weapons in the military context. You know how powerful it is, and therefore you would not use it lightly. You would think very hard, and sometimes the very threat is enough to have a deterrent effect. Because once you use it, it's very hard to tell with all the interlinkages how this is going to spread across the global financial system. And the other thing is that if you keep using it, more and more countries are going to get worried about the dominance of the dollar and the US-based payment system and clearing system and settlement system. Now, there are no viable alternatives today, but countries are not going to sit still for their own security and resilience. And this includes the friends of the United States, because if you had a change in regime in the United States that is no longer friendly and going to be trigger happy with using this. So I think the US also understands this, that if we threaten this too much, others, even our friends, are going to look for alternatives. Now, they may not look promising in the next 3 to 5 years, but who knows? Maybe they could. And a lot of the interest in blockchains and distributed ledgers is trying to achieve some of this so that you don't depend on a payment and settlement system that is dollar-dominated. Of course, the big tricky thing is that ultimately, what is a currency of transaction and settlement that is going to be widely accepted? You're already seeing local currency usage rising, nowhere near at a level to challenge the dominance of the dollar. But I think those are signs that this is not a static situation. And so the wiser heads in America understand this, and this is power that is to be used very judiciously if you want to continue to hold that power.
One more follow-up on your opening remarks, thank you, Ravi, is Singapore and ASEAN more broadly, amidst all these shifts on trade, investment, technology, and finance, seems to be the recipient of various forms of inflows of people, of finance, of investment. How do you see the situation? I mean, is ASEAN in a sense a beneficiary of the fragmentation, or is that sort of short-term thinking? Because of course you and Singaporean officials have always been multilateralist and very committed to the rules order. So how do you think through that?
Yeah, so I think there are two effects. At the risk of misusing economics analogy, I think there are income and substitution effects. The aggregate income effects are that global trade, global investment, global integration at a very aggregate level is coming down. That cannot be good for open economies in Southeast Asia like ASEAN and especially Singapore. So all the benefits of that are going to be diluted. Then there are the substitution effects which arise from responses of companies and businesses to the new realities where they reconfigure supply chains and trade patterns shift and change. And there you will have sectoral winners and losers. Sometimes even entire countries can be better off. I would think so far the substitution effects are more second order and the income effects are larger. So this can't be good for ASEAN or for Singapore, even if at the margin some companies and some countries will gain some areas.
Thank you for that. So let me take you back out more broadly. You have, in conversations ahead of this conference, you've expressed concerns about the world sort of regressing to a lose-lose equilibrium, which is another way of characterizing what you said about shrinking income effects. And this very much resonates with some of the things Danny Quah said in his opening of the sessions yesterday or 2 days ago. What do you think are the dangerous currents we need to follow or be alert to in this context?
Yeah, so again, I think the objective of both sets of countries is to get into some kind of win-lose equilibrium where they hope to gain the upper hand in relative terms, and therefore that would be a good outcome. I think we know from experience and we know from game theory, if both parties go for a win-lose equilibrium, you end up in a lose-lose equilibrium, the worst quadrant possible. And I think that is more likely the outcome. Again, in a partial setting, in some industries, in some sectors, it could be win-lose. Maybe in electronics or chips, the United States would have an advantage. But if you look at the broader picture, I can't imagine how they can sustain a win-lose in every dimension. Now, there are others in the US who believe that, well, even if you lose some in terms of economic efficiency and outcomes, the advantages in security posture are worth it. Again, I guess you could conceivably make an argument on that basis. I'm not sure whether that will necessarily be achieved, or the cost may be too high. The economic cost that is paid to achieve a very small advantage in geosecurity may not be worth it. Again, this is all brinksmanship. I think I read what the U.S. is saying about small yards and high fences. I think conceptually that is correct. I can also understand the logic of it, that you have national security concerns in specific areas, but we're not looking to complete decoupling, but we want to make sure that in these specific areas we want to hold an advantage, and so we're going to erect high fences, but we're going to keep it small. The problem is your yard is interconnected with other yards, and it's going to be difficult, especially with chips. It gets into everything. Even Gen AI, artificial intelligence, all of them require chips. And they're going to get into green technologies and renewables. So the yard is not going to be static, and the danger is that it will start growing. And when it grows, then the economic inefficiencies and costs will start to ratchet up. So theoretically, I think what they're trying to do makes sense. I just don't think in practice it will necessarily pan out that way. So we could all end up in a lose-lose equilibrium. And this is where it's doubly tragic for the poorer countries and the developing countries. The IMF has studied this, and they imagined very simply 2 blocks and so on. There is a cost to the West, there's a cost to China. But the bigger cost is to the developing and emerging economies in the world in terms of their output and their standard of living. And that, I think, is a real shame.
So just sort of building on that, are there any historical examples or current areas where there's no fence, there's a nice open common yard that everybody's dogs play in together? Sorry, it's not quite as neat an analogy, I guess. But I mean, just more broadly, it's not so much looking for good news, it's looking for cases or examples, of how one gets out of this, or where we can build on current areas that have not yet succumbed to this kind of arrangement.
Yeah. One possibility is, and people have said it, probably the most compelling issue on which the US and China should cooperate and can potentially cooperate is climate change mitigation. Because that's a global problem. With chips, yes, there's an argument, it can be dual use, you can use it for weaponry, and it gets into a lot of things, and you want to maintain an economic advantage, and I can see that competition. But one way in which we can avoid a lose-lose equilibrium is to, even as you define some yards with high walls, are there other parts of the playing field where you can deliberately make it very open? Because in this space, I am less sensitive and I trust you more. So I'm realistic enough to know that they're not going to give up on protecting chips, and the chip war will, I can't see how that can be retracted. But I see a danger of that spreading into other areas. So even as you tighten in one area, is there scope to really be open and collaborative in other areas? Because both countries gain. And it is an area where China has distinct advantages, which will benefit the US. And it is in the interest of both countries to cooperate in that space. When you have that countervailing collaboration in one area, then maybe the overall playing field doesn't get overly corrupted by those few areas where there are high restrictions.
So we'll shortly be coming to our distinguished in-person audience, as well as our online audience for questions. MD Menon has kindly kept this all on the record. For those of you online, if you wish to submit a question in the question box on YouTube, please do. Just identify yourself. Again, for people in the room, we'll go with microphones, or you can go to the stands or to have a microphone brought to you. So just a final point, asking you to be a bit visionary then. How do we course correct to try to get back from too many of these high fences or conflicts? And in particular, this is our theme, as you know, for our conference. what can the countries that are not China or US, what can Singapore, ASEAN, the developing world as a whole, the non-economic great powers, what role can they play?
Oh, I think that there is quite a lot they can, because most countries, including countries that regard themselves as friends of the US or friends of China or friends of both, actually don't want to be overly identified with either party or either camp, and they want to keep their options open, even if they lean towards and they understand they have closer relations with one than the other. And so let's not forget that the rest of the world trades more with each other than the US and China, likewise for investment flows. And so I think while the multilateral system is, in a sense under threat because of the conflicts between the major powers, we might see interesting groupings of like-minded countries coming together to do things. Some call it minilaterals, some call it plurilaterals, but I think there will be new geometries and new configurations which countries in their self-interest to survive in this contested environment will seek new arrangements. I think companies and corporates, global multinationals, will also do that because they are intent on maximizing efficiency and maximizing economic gains, and they will also get ingenious. So I do think there is hope. It is not a first best solution, it's maybe not even a second best solution, but the ingenuity of human beings and countries and corporations to find ways around it, I think has something to go for it. And you already see some of that happening in many parts of the world with different groups. And you could also have, as I said earlier on, in sectoral arrangements. Even at the heyday of the WTO, I think it was in the 70s or 80s, a small group of countries, major electronics producers, came together and set rules in a plurilateral setting without trying to achieve a global consensus. But they pretty much set the rules, the protocols, and the regulations and rules of the game, as it were, for the trade of electronic goods. And you've seen a massive boom in electronics trade, benefiting Asia hugely and benefiting Singapore hugely because we were part of that network. So can we have similar sectoral initiatives? Again, clean technologies comes to mind, which can be readily adapted across countries, green technologies and so on, or energy transition solutions. If we can find sectoral initiatives that bring together countries without necessarily having to bring the entire countries together, that could be another way.
Thanks very much. So let me turn it now to our audience, and I'm also checking here for online questions. Jacob, if we could have a mic. Please, for our online audience, identify yourself.
Jacob Kierkegaard from the Peterson Institute. I guess it was last week that Sam Bankman-Fried was convicted for fraud, sort of highlighting, in my opinion, the sort of basic fraudulent nature of crypto. But at the same time, I have been sort of surprised over the last couple of years that the Bitcoin and others still seem to be trading, not at the levels that they did a few years ago, but still relatively high, which leads some to sort of indicate that maybe there is a huge, consistent demand from basically from criminals and others. And I'm wondering, what does that tell us about the broader state of combating against tax evasion, money laundering, and those types of things in the global financial system? Does it say anything, or is it just purely peripheral? Thank you.
Well, I think the private cryptocurrencies are part of a much larger ecosystem, which you would probably describe as digital assets or distributed ledgers. The underlying principle or objective there being, can we have transactions take place in a zero trust environment? All commercial and economic transactions take place with an element of trust. That's what brings the cost down. In cross-border settings, that is more difficult. In today's contested world, it's more difficult. Can we have solutions around it? I think that's the beginning of the distributed ledger movement, the blockchain movement. Mostly people of a very libertarian persuasion, some extremely so, who did not trust governments and wanted this. And then you have the phenomenon of cryptocurrencies as the engine to drive that, providing an incentive to mine and date and do the verifications. I think that has gone down the wrong path. It has only led to a lot of speculative activity. A lot of people have gotten hurt. Many crypto companies have collapsed. There's a lot of fraudulent activity, and I should not paint with a broad brush the entire crypto industry because, as a digital industry ecosystem, I think that's something even Singapore is promoting very actively. But I think our focus is not so much on the cryptocurrency, but on the tokenization of assets, so that if you can tokenize securities and financial assets and even real assets, you can put them on chain and have, transfer of ownership. You can have seamless trade. So we're looking at trade and exchange opportunities on the distributed ledger at much lower cost. Some of the best experiments and pilots that are being done are trying to reduce the cost of trade financing, trying to reduce the cost of cross-border payments and settlement, capital market transactions from pre-trade to post-trade in a seamless fashion. A lot of good work has been going in that space. I think unfortunately, the attention has focused on the cryptocurrencies as a medium of speculative gain, and also for fraudulent activities, it's for money laundering and so on. But it misses the larger point that the real technology breakthroughs are happening with tokenization, with use cases that are truly compelling and useful, and the use of the distributed ledger to actually lower costs. Now, we haven't reached a point where any of this is really scalable. We've got very successful pilots, but as you scale, the costs seem to go up. So a lot of innovative energy is being spent on that space, trying to make it happen. And this is the nature of all early technologies. So I'm still quite hopeful of that industry. It's a bit like what securitization did for finance, 50 years ago. Tokenization actually monetizes a whole range of assets that people can use for collateral, for trade, for exchange, and so on, which I think holds a lot of promise.
Thank you. Next question.
Hello. Thanks. James Crabtree. On Sunday evening, we had a discussion that somebody asked about the upcoming Xi-Biden summit that we assume to happen later this month. There's a lot of discussion in the security domain about guardrails. The IMF put out a staff note a few months ago where they set up a framework thinking about guardrails as a way of looking at other issues where the interests of the great powers are not aligned. So on those most difficult issues, what might a set of guardrails look like, the minimum that you could try and build? I wondered, as you looked across the landscape that you've discussed in your remarks, which are the areas that you're most worried about in terms of kind of the US and China being not aligned well in the financial space, and what might some guardrails look like, some practical frameworks that countries like Singapore or others try and suggest to keep this competition in check?
Well, I think in the trade area, over 50 years of negotiations and dialogue and collaboration, we have more or less rules of the game, as it were, not always observed, but at least as a process through which you can try to resolve them. Unfortunately, it takes very long to resolve them. In the finance area, I think there are less guardrails in the sense of what are actions that are clearly not allowed. Even if you have a disagreement between two countries or two parties, there are things that you should not do. I think in the trade dimension, there's a bit more clarity, but in the finance area, there is less clarity. And I think there is merit, I would totally agree that we need to have some guardrails. The reason being, you don't want to get into a situation where you take measures, inviting countermeasures, that then accumulate to something that neither party wanted to have at all. That happens in war, and that's why you have communication channels, you have rules of engagement, and ways to break the circuit before it gets out of hand. I think we have guardrails domestically in our financial markets to prevent things from getting worse, prevent things from escalating, but in the cross-border setting, we probably don't have enough guardrails. And I think while there is recognition that financial sanctions and counter-sanctions can have multiplier effects that can get out of hand, we need to channel some of that concern and apprehension to setting some guardrails so that it will bind future players who will stop short of unleashing something that they are subsequently not able to control.
Great agenda, something we should think about at Peterson. With all that talk about arms, I got a little scared when the mic dropped. Another question or comment for MD Menon? Yeah.
Thank you, Ravi, for a wonderful time that you've shared with us, your insights. I wanted to, if I may, press you a bit more on the things that smaller states might be helpful on in this current fragmenting world. And I'm concerned in particular about what ASEAN might be able to do. Earlier we've had discussions about how ASEAN might consider an electricity grid, clean energy agreements among the states of ASEAN. Sometimes when we've talked about geopolitics, there are those who've said that ASEAN can show that it is friends with the great powers so that neither great power feels isolated and therefore threatened. From where you sit, what do you think, what further things should ASEAN be thinking about in terms of helping restore a more peaceful, more prosperous region and more prosperous world? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. I think ASEAN or Southeast Asia is a very powerful example of what I mentioned earlier about plurilateral arrangements, regional integration efforts. It's not the first best world, but given that we are not going to get into a first best world, what are these? And Europe has, in a way, charted that direction. I think Europe's strength and influence comes from being one bloc, despite the huge differences they have among themselves. But by being together and speaking with one voice, they exert an influence and protect their space and have buffer. ASEAN, I think, is not in, I think institutionally will not take that form, but I think in many other ways is also getting together as a very integrated bloc. China trades more with ASEAN than it does with the United States. That changed just about 3 years ago, that we are a bigger trading partner for China than the United States is for China. And the direct investment flows vis-a-vis the US are very strong into ASEAN. So I think ASEAN has 650 million people, fourth or fifth largest GDP in the world. If it can operate as a single market and increasingly as a single economic entity, I think it gives it a lot more space, both geopolitically as well as geoeconomically, and also to buffer some of the storms that arise when there's big power conflicts. I think some of the newer areas like digitalization and green technologies are areas where ASEAN can set the pace. In fact, we need to move beyond the old disciplines of trade in goods and services, to trade in digital flows and data connectivity. And so the initiatives that Singapore has been taking is very much in that space. We signed a digital economy agreement with Australia. We're reaching out to others, constantly talking to the US on a digital economy agreement. And of course, I think there is intellectual agreement with this is the future, but then they need to get around some other obstacles, which are quite understandable. But I think if we can set more of such templates, greater digital connectivity, greater data connectivity, trusted data corridors, which protect the confidentiality and privacy of information, but while allowing the benefits that come from aggregation of data and cross-border flows. So I think if we can have more of that. We also have green economy agreements, where I think we want to collaborate much more actively in clean technologies and renewable energy. The ASEAN energy grid is something Singapore is championing very strongly, because the distribution of countries' ability to generate renewable energy is not the same. And so electricity imports and energy interdependence, I think, will become very important. And again, the initiatives that are being driven in this part of the world along those lines, I think, are the kinds that we need more of in other parts of the world, so that you get the benefits of diversification through a multiplicity of overlapping regional agreements. And this is probably an area that I would say trade theorists and advocates and friends of free trade like all of us probably should spend a bit of time on. I think there are three challenges that have come up against globalization. One has been around with us for about 20, 30 years. We didn't take sufficient action against it, which is the distribution issue. That while open markets and free trade have raised the welfare of most, its gains have not been distributed evenly. And this is an area of focus, I think, increasingly in public policy and initiative and academic research. I think the second threat that has emerged more recently, especially since COVID, is resilience. That resilience requires redundancies, some loss of efficiency, and you need to cost that resilience into your calculations. And that's something that, again, countries and companies are doing more of. And then there's security, and we've spoken about that. If there is a view that there are areas of national security which should trump open markets and free trade, how do you put guardrails around it so that it doesn't become infectious, that you can contain it, and how do you do this intelligently? And this is new terrain, and I hope before countries embark on erecting barriers in the name of national security, that we pay a lot of attention to, if you need to do it and must do it, fair, but how do you do it in a way that doesn't upset the entire global order, which is what I think we might end up doing at the rate we are going, without any idea of how this is going to pan out for what we have taken 50, 60, 70 years to build up and provided so much prosperity.